Hi, welcome to Lean Blog Interviews. I'm your host, Mark Rabin. We have two guests today. We're joined by Steve Pereira and Andrew Davis. They are authors of the new book titled Flow Engineering, From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. The foreword is written by Karen Martin, author of a book called Value Stream Mapping. She's a friend of mine and a frequent guest on this podcast. So Steve and Andrew, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks so much,
Thanks for having us.
Honor to be here, and it's great fun.
Yeah, so we're going to have a great conversation here today. Let me do the part that's usually like the least favorite part of a guest's experience. I'm going to read bios. I'm going to we hate sitting through these, but Steve Pereira has spent over 2 decades improving the flow of work across organizations. He's worked through tech support, IT management, platform and infrastructure engineering, product management, and as a founding chief technology officer for enterprise SaaS company. He serves as CEO of Visible Consulting, as COO to the Value Stream Management Consortium, chair of the OASIS VSM Interoperability Technical Committee, and co-founder of the Flow Collective to bring flow-focused professionals together. And since 2017, he's been developing and facilitating flow engineering. So Steve, again, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks very much. Honored to be here.
Was everything correct? Hopefully no mistakes in the bio there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of flow. It's a lot of value streams. That's the TLDR.
Yeah. too long didn't listen.
Right.
I'll try to break it down here. And we're also joined by Andrew Davis, Chief Product Officer at AutoRABIT. Hopefully I'm saying, okay. Yep. Mistake-free so far. It won't last too long, and that's okay. He is author of Mastering Salesforce DevOps. He's a Salesforce architect, developer, and product leader with a focus on the human side of software development. Andrew's been the leading figure in introducing DevOps concepts to the Salesforce world. Trained as an engineer, he spent 15 years as a Buddhist monk. Wow. Teaching meditation and personal transformation and helping develop communities of practice. These days, he studies the intersection of business, technology, and psychology through systems thinking. So Andrew, again, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
There's a particular kind of Zen perspective. I get neurotic almost about making mistakes, but there's a certain level of teaching kind of in the realm of Buddhism. Could I ask you about that just as a quick indulgence?
Sure. In terms of the relationship between making mistakes and learning and
or the idea there are really no mistakes, or
sure, yeah. I mean I'm wanting to. I think my mind's now so entrained to the world of flow and so forth that I'm wanting to.
I didn't mean to throw you off. Sorry.
Quote Goldratt and so forth is saying that in physics there are no mistakes, right? There's no such thing as there's no problems in physics. Mm-hmm. There's no problems.
That's the first thing I thought of.
Because everything in the world of physics is already perfectly balanced, right? There's something that's falling through the air at every moment. It's perfect exactly where it is because it's the convergence of all these forces. And so I would say the equivalent, Buddha was a sort of foundational philosopher for humanity. And I think the equivalent idea is that everything that's going on psychologically right now is perfect in the sense that it's a convergence of this sort of infinite, inconceivable variety of factors, right? That we're a product of biology, our society at this moment in time, everything that's come before that. There's a cause or a reason for everything, including all of the problematic bits. But still within this, we've got this attachment to everything being perfect, everything going right, especially us. We have attachment to being liked and being comfortable and these kinds of things. And that is extraordinarily problematic, right? Because as you know, we're in a world where mistakes are happening continuously and the world is continuously diverging from the way we want it to be. We get everything just perfectly and then all of a sudden it changes. And so from one point of view, it looks like our minds are just the most imperfect thing ever because we're out of touch with reality. We're wholly attached to some ideal that can't be achieved, but that even that is perfect in the sense that there's reasons why that happens, and there's ways we can undo it. And I think one of the best ways is learning to be at peace with making mistakes. And so that's why I was so delighted with the thesis of your podcasts.
Yeah. Well, the other podcast, My Favorite Mistake, and I hold a mug here. I drink water out of it. There's the logo, but the other side of the mug has my reminders to myself and mantras. And there would be different ways of stating these, but be kind to yourself. Is at least one way that that's helpful to me, and I think sometimes helpful to others. We're imperfect, and that includes. I mean, sometimes we hold business leaders to maybe too high of a standard, and there are reminders that we're all imperfect. So it started off. My curiosity gets the best of me. That started off very. We got very philosophical. Steve, what's that?
I just want to dive in because that was the Goldratt was also the first thing that came to mind when you started mentioning that. The thing that always stuck in my head, I think, is most profound from Goldratt. It's not the theory of constraints. Was there are no conflicts in reality, right? That is very profound, and then you combine that with, I think it was Deming who said that maybe it was Decker said that the system's perfectly engineered to produce the outcomes that it does, right? Those are very freeing concepts. If you really take them to heart, they kind of give us permission to fail and to remove ourselves from, the direct cause or let's say contributors to faults and errors, because, we're all really trying to do our best given the circumstances at any given moment.
Yeah. And, we think of how this cascades into organizations. I think, Andrew, it's thought-provoking what you say about, things are meant, I'm going to paraphrase back, things are meant to be this way, even the problems, and even bringing it back from society or societies. When you think in organizations, like how do we balance acceptance or understanding how things have come to be while wanting to change or help organizations improve or even transform? That's a lofty goal. Thinking of, well, why do some leaders blame individuals for systemic problems, or why do some leaders set what seem like unrealistic goals for a development team and then hammer on people when they don't reach those goals? I mean, those things are, there's probably no single root cause to those conditions, right?
I mean, there is a root cause in the sense of, we all want to be free from the pain of things not going well as quickly as possible. And so the root cause is, if I can figure out that actually it kind of looks like it was Mark's fault, then that resolves the dilemma of me trying to figure out what to do, because I've got an answer, right? Oh, let's just blame Mark, right? And it's Mark again, right? And then it's a very simple explanation for everybody, because everybody's like, yeah, Mark. And then it makes the world simple. So everybody, I think, craves a simple solution.
Sure.
The problem with systems, especially these kinds of social systems you're talking about, is that they are invisible. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems with them. They're totally invisible, and they take place over time, and they deal with all these like psychological factors in our minds, relationships between people, patterns of behavior, technology. Basically, there's so much involved. It's really hard to understand what's going on. It's a system of systems, right? So it's a mess by definition in Ackoff's terms. And so we crave simple solutions. And then because we crave to be free from pain, if we can find a simple solution to a problem, we're like, yeah, that's it. So that would be my root cause analysis.
So we're going to have a chance to dive into talk about the book, Flow Engineering, and some of the principles there. Not promising or clamoring for simple solutions. There's a lot of thoughtful things in the book. But before talking about the book, maybe the stories cascade into that a little bit. I'd like to hear origin stories of why do people like Deming and Goldratt and Ackoff and others resonate with you? Why do you get into these realms of improvement work, regardless of how it's labeled? So Steve, I'm going to ask you, maybe go first. Tell your origin story before Andrew.
Sure. I mean, if I TLDR the origin story, or TLDL.
And we have
the origin
time, so
story.
you don't have.
Yeah,
Well,
but I
you
mean,
can TLDR it, then give us the longer version. I guess.
who wants the origin? Everybody just wants what's next. How do I stamp this onto my organization? But the the origin story for me, if I'm thinking about the macro of it, I've always been a creature of inspiration and kind of bursts of energy and enthusiasm. Not a very systematic person, not process oriented. And Andrew's nodding his head because he knows that I'm just constantly distracted and
I fall into the same pattern. But
we're similar in that we've had many conversations about this, and I think that really motivates my fascination with systems and process and how people can kind of come together and dedicate their attention towards getting things done consistently with high quality without burning out and feeling like they're doing meaningful work and not working against each other but working with each other, and that to me is kind of this ideal that I hold in my mind of what a great life looks like, is being able to work with others and create wonderful things. And very averse to this idea of work as toil and struggling, rolling a boulder up a hill continuously, because I've experienced wonderful work and beautiful collaboration, right, and inspiration that's shared amongst many people, and so I'm kind of just chasing that feeling and chasing how do we build that. And how do we build it in a sustainable way? So it's not just these random sparks.
Yeah.
So this is abstract, but it's really my first efforts into kind of engineering flow come from building and releasing software, and all the way back to burning CDs and really bad version control systems and running around trying to get people's merges to not conflict, really long, painful meetings, incident response where I took down production on a critical day, the day before we had a giant customer release. And so it's a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, and a lot of avoiding that or striving for this state of collective flow that I like to talk about. And between Andrew and I, we kind of like focus our attention in slightly different ways. I'm very much fascinated by this big picture of like, how do you get an entire organization? It's a very mechanistic idea of like, how do you make a machine of an entire organization that's not mechanistic, but you kind of have a system of work that functions and allows everybody to contribute. And Andrew's my counterpart in kind of the individual, how do you get people into a state of flow and enable that personal experience of flow. So that's how we kind of try to avoid stepping on each other's toes, but also benefit from each other's different perspectives.
Yeah. And I think, Steve, you and I, did we first cross paths at an Agile conference in Winnipeg? Am I remembering that right? It was some time ago.
I would love that to be our origin story, but I don't think I had the pleasure. No, I can't recall ever being in Winnipeg for an Agile conference.
Okay, then that is my mistake. And that's
okay. That would be wonderful. I'd love for us to have a long storied history.
Right.
Sounds like a romance. You remember that Agile conference in Winnipeg?
Yeah, I mean,
Farm and then
Scrum
team.
Well, I haven't gotten yet to the question of how you two ended up collaborating on the book, so that's a teaser. We'll come back to that. But no, I mean, I appreciate you wanting to talk more about aspirations than origins, is what I hear you saying, Steve. But that's okay.
Well, I feel humble origins. But yeah, in service of, how do we avoid friction and these, these terrible feelings of failure and being a part of a system that is working against us, and moving towards a system where, we can all contribute and be a part of something wonderful.
Yeah.
Has really been the thread for me.
Yeah. So stepping back from origins for a second, when you talk about process, or as I've learned to say in certain parts of Canada, process,
I've been through the ringer on that one.
I've had conversations. I mean, I've attended some of these Agile conferences. This is certainly not my domain, but as being somebody who, I would describe myself as, I have a degree in industrial engineering, but you often think about process engineering and process design and process improvement. And to me, process, this has such positive connotations. More process generally helps us. But then there's this, it seems like backlash sometimes in software circles are like, people cringe and like, no, process. So like, process is the enemy. So to kind of try to frame it as a question is that backlash because people have tried to make things too rigid in a way that's actually kind of interfering instead of being helpful? I see you nodding your head, Steve.
Well, I'm going to throw out an answer to that, and I'm going to throw to Andrew for his origin story. But I think that what happens in software and product development is an aversion to premature convergence, right? And premature standardization, right? So what do we know about software? It's you're delivering change, right? I mean, you're not producing duplicate items. You're not manufacturing products. You're developing products, right? So that means that every focus is dedicated towards change, and process doesn't typically do too well in facilitating that and enabling it. It's at least in large organizations, which is where we see a lot of our opportunities, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times process gets implemented in response to mistakes, right? In response to breakdowns of communication and collaboration. So it ends up being constraining, right? A governing constraint rather than an enabling constraint. I don't know if this language is something that gets thrown around a lot in these circles, but if you think about things that help us do the right thing versus stop us from doing the wrong thing, I think, the negative perception of process is this is just holding us back by restricting us from making mistakes that could be beneficial, right? Sometimes you change things, there's a little, issue, but you're actually on the way to something great. And so the more you constrain, the more you kind of restrict bad things from happening, that can restrict innovation, it can restrict collaboration and freedom and flow and all these things that we actually want.
Yeah, but I think there's a piece to that. The concern about premature standardization is understandable. If we need to be iterative, if we're going to continue going through Deming's PDSA cycles, we don't want to stop those cycles. But then it seems like there's always this, or often this concern that process means permanent as opposed to continued PDSA cycles, like process and then Kaizen, strengthening and improving the process. And it seems like if bigger organizations that don't have that Kaizen habit, I could see where some sort of I understand the fear of things being locked in, and I think that wouldn't be the intent of a Lean or a Toyota based or a Deming based system to defend process.
In defense of process. I would, I'd love to, obviously if somebody listens to this and they've got a better insight than I can offer, I'd love to reach out and tell me. But I think life looks very different if you're the industrial engineer, process engineer who's creating the systems that everybody else has to operate in, versus if you're a worker bee who's living in those processes, living in those systems. And so if as an industrial engineer and so forth, designing processes are beautiful because they're a creative act for you. You tune them and you optimize them and you make them work and so forth. And so but the experience of having a process that was created by somebody you don't know at some time, probably in the distant past, for reasons that may not be relevant to what you're facing right now, that's a very different experience. And I think that there is I think some of it is the transition into the digital world. I keep doing this with my hands. I don't know if that
It doesn't come through in the audio, but yeah.
So, in this transition from whatever pre-digital organizations to digital organizations, obviously in digital organizations, things are happening at a much faster time scale. So where you've got processes that were designed, to unfold over days, weeks, months, and the software developers are doing things that are designed to unfold over milliseconds and seconds and minutes. I do think, as a software person, my brain was a little bit rewired on a faster time scale. Like I've got a little bit of impatience, like, come on, do this, do this, do this. And so not as much patience for these long-term project managery kinds of things that, and so I think that there can be there's kind of a generational rebellion from the digital generation to the pre-digital generation. And then as well, I think software development is fundamentally, it's a creative act. And it's very concentration intensive. And if you're dragged out of your flow, so to speak, your concentration, and forced to go to a meeting you didn't really want to go to, or fill out a form, you don't really understand the process or the context. You don't understand how that could possibly be beneficial for you, or who it's helping and how it's helping. You're just lacking that context. Now, that was a big topic that we did touch on in the book, the lack of clarity when you're operating in organizations at scale.
Yeah.
And flow.
And I think, there's another trap that I think you touched on there, of that separation between the process thinkers and the worker bees, the engineers, and I think one of the huge innovations within Toyota, looking at the factory as a model, which is probably not a great parallel to software development, I realize, but this idea is, Toyota people will say standardized work is created by the people doing the work. Now, there may be input from engineers and supervisors, but it's really blurring or smashing that silo of well, you're going to be involved in designing the process. You're certainly going to be involved in monitoring and improving the process. I think that's one thing that it is really important to bring. It's helpful in a factory, but now we think of bringing into healthcare organization where everyone's got a master's degree and an advanced degree. Of course, they want to be respected and involved and engaged that way. And I think the same would be true for people working in software.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that there's also, it's bad process. It's process that's imposed from somebody else. And that's what maybe gives a little bit of a bad name. And then as the sort of agile wave happened over the last 20 years, I think it's an energy saving technique. We all try to learn the absolute least we have to about something to figure it out. And so I learned agile by being on a team of developers, and so I'm like, oh yeah, agile, oh yeah, that's the thing where you do the daily stand-ups, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, we do that. And so you've not really looked into, well, what's this sprint retro thing about again, anyway, which is all about the team designing their own processes, designing their own standard work. How did that work? What do we need to improve? And so there's a lack of, people, developers in many cases have they slot into the rhythms and the tactics and the methods of some of these practices, but haven't really understood the principles.
Yeah, I think there's risk of that, or not having the foundations, as you touch on in the book. Favorite practice of mind, concept and practice of mind, psychological safety. None of this works without that foundation. And I think Toyota people kind of take it for granted. I don't mean that as an insult, but if they have that environment and then they write and talk about, well, here are all the things that work really well at Toyota. You try to put those practices in an organization where people get punished for speaking up. Of course it fails. But Steve, you were going to jump in.
I think, one thing we talk about with psychological safety a lot, and it's the thing that I find is missing is intention, right? let's say, intentional design of psychological safety versus intention of psychological safety. We can talk about it and we can sort of, make best efforts to kind of create it in our spaces. But how is it actually systematically implemented as part of the organization so that we know that, if we do these things and if these things are true, then we have created psychological safety in a way that we can interrogate it. We know when it's failing. We have signals that tell us if it's going away or if it's being violated. I think we're missing that in a lot of places. We're talking about it now and we're sort of making efforts, but I think it's still kind of rare to have it be part of the DNA of, or the, as you say, the foundation of the organization. One other thing that I came to mind talking about process was, that process is often kind of implemented moving forwards versus, working forwards rather than working backwards. So sort of we encounter an issue, we find a flaw, we create an error in production, and then we create process to kind of avoid that rather than working backwards from what kind of outcome are we trying to create and then what mechanism will enable that outcome to be produced at scale and sustainably over time and not impact psychological safety or, incur a undue cognitive load that is in a way that, multiple people can contribute without stepping on each other's toes. Like, that's very hard to do when you're working forwards because you're just reacting to, okay, well, this happened, so let's make sure it never happens again. And that's just this additive, and that's really taxing on people, right? Because it's like, well, what's the process this week in response to the thing that happened last week? And who's going back and saying, well, knowing what we know, let's redesign the process to enable what we want rather than avoid all the things that we don't want.
Yeah. I mean, and that one approach you described there, Steve, makes me think less of process and more of firefighting.
Yes.
Or workarounds. And that's a very common thing in healthcare. We layer reactive, double check, workaround, firefighting on top of kind of a shaky process. And then that just adds a lot of burden and may or may not help with the underlying problem. Or even if it did, people can only work so many minutes in an hour. And you start piling, these things on top that slow the work down. I think of John Grout, who's been a guest on this podcast a number of times, an expert on mistake proofing. He always points out the best mistake proofing doesn't slow you down. That's, I think, the ideal. And maybe some of these process things are slowing people down, and there's understandable conflict maybe caused by that.
It's very interesting thinking about psychological safety as a foundation. I sort of went deep thinking about what you're saying there. It's, I would say the whole of human, history, we've been trying to figure out how to establish psychological safety in the sense of what are the rules or norms that allow a group of people to work peacefully and exist peacefully together. And the bigger societies have gotten, the more you've got, whole new kinds of crises arising and so forth. And so it just, it's a very subtle thing. This whole idea of there's this asymmetry of trust, right? That it takes a long time to build trust, and it can be destroyed very, very quickly.
Right.
And so there is a sort of a settling in period where you're getting to know another person, your manager, your coworkers, people on another team, and so forth, where you don't immediately trust, and and maybe that's not inappropriate, but there's a relaxing, like a deep kind of relaxing to where you get to the point where you can share your ideas and your insights openly. And I think Steve and I, you at some point asked about, Steve and I writing the book together. And certainly one of my big experiences, starting to work with him 3.5 years ago, was we just jammed, right? And I just felt like I could share my wackiest ideas with him, like the ones that I wasn't, I'd never quite articulated because they didn't quite seem like people would understand them or be open to them in in the workplace. And then when I did that, it was just this real creative, cauldron, all kinds of ideas getting kicked up, and and some of my wacky ideas he found more useful, maybe some less useful, whatever. But that's kind of a settling in, right? And certain environments, it's like a team that works really well together. And one of the points of psychological safety is that you can be honest with each other. And like, if I say, Steve, I really think that's a terrible idea, I feel psychologically safe enough with him to say, actually, that was a really terrible idea. And so you've got some strength in the relationship that allows you to surface unpleasant facts, observations. Hey, this really isn't working. So sorry, I messed that up.
There's one other aspect to this that actually adds a really interesting dynamic in that, we're collaborating where, the ultimate goal is value delivery to a customer. And so psychological safety is in service of being able to say, I like that, but how does that serve our customer or our target outcome or what we're trying to do? And how do we leverage that and bring it to, into alignment with somebody else's sense of what they're hoping to do, what we want to enable, their kind of context. And, there's another piece about, writing a book. You want to establish a sense of safety for the reader. We're not dumping a bunch of stuff on you and saying that, if you don't understand this, you're way behind, or, you'll never really understand how to work effectively if you don't get these concepts. And so that was very, that was a welcome challenge. And I think that was very very positive experience for me, was trying to place this target outcome outside of my own goals and say, what does it take to bring a reader to where I am with my mindset of how I look at work and, the things that I find important and what I've seen work well in organizations, without dragging them along, right? Inviting them and enabling their kind of engagement with the material and these ideas, and how do we package it in a way that's accessible to them and inclusive and more invitation based than demanding or downloading information to them. So I really enjoyed that, and that reconciliation I thought was very rewarding. Trying to work with Andrew as a counterpart and a colleague with different ideas, and then having this reader who represents all these different people, right? It's us in the past. We're trying to what would I tell myself 10 years ago? And what do I tell that person who's just starting out? And what do I tell the person who's jaded and, thinks about processes like this totally negative thing? And all of those things kind of packaged up into this avatar that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about psychological safety and trust, interrelated concepts there, is how situational it is. The two of you, Steve and Andrew, have worked together for years now. You collaborated on the book. At some point, that trust had to be built, or maybe, Andrew, you tend to be a candid person, and you tested the waters with Steve, and he responded well, to some of the candor. So you think, well, okay, well, maybe I'll give Steve more candor, or who's inviting the candor, who's receiving the candor well, as opposed to thinking of the three of us here. Steve and I have talked briefly. Andrew and I have never met. Andrew, would you feel the same candor to say, "Hey, Mark, that was a really terrible question"?
And Andrew would never say that a question is terrible. First of all, he would never be so short-sighted and offensive.
I err on the side of being polite. That's fair. I think some of it is situational, depending on the
Mhm.
people, but then you build confidence, right? And that's the power. That's where there is a flywheel effect, right? Where you get comfortable working in an environment where you open, collaborative, and so forth. And you go to your next organization, you just set that expectation, like, all right, listen, I'm just going to tell you directly, and so there is a kind of internal strength that we can build, and I think a lot of it is this sort of we're the counterpart of psychological safety is the fragility of our ego, right? Like
Mhm.
how vulnerable do we feel? The less vulnerable you feel, the more safe you'll feel. The
Right.
more you'll feel much more safe in most environments. And so, everybody has environments that frighten them. Fear is the most fundamental reaction we can possibly have. So, how's your psychological safety doing when you're in a pit of, wild dogs? It's like,
Physical safety is a problem then.
yeah, so there's always a threshold that's beyond our capacity, but we build capacity, right? As we build expectations of what it's like to interact with others, and then become less and less self-conscious, less and less, whatever factors are conspiring to cause that fear internally, then
Right.
bring your safety with you.
So let me pick this up and kind of I'm thinking of the reader who's like, I thought this was a book about value streams. What are you guys talking about? So this actually is a pivotal requirement for that kind of underpins flow engineering as an effort, because the hardest thing that you'll encounter when you try to work with a group of people to map out the flow of their work is this sense that people feel personally scrutinized and criticized by this effort unless it's properly framed in the context of, we're looking at the system, we're looking at the team level, not the individual level. We're not looking at what people are individually doing. We want to understand the overall flow of work. And for us to do that, we need people's direct experience of that work.
Mhm.
And we need the truth
Mhm.
from people about how long it takes to do things, what's involved, who hands work to who, what happens, does it pile up, does it flow right through, does it get stuck, is it reworked 8 times because there's some kind of missing requirement that never makes it into the definition of the work that needs to be done. Are we testing and retesting? Are we throwing things over walls to people who don't have all the context? To really understand the flow of work, you have to have this level of visibility and insight that requires psychological safety. It requires people to show up and say, here's what I see. You might see something different. And, that's a reason why we get a variety of stakeholders involved. But, we don't want somebody off in the corner saying, this is a waste of time, or if I speak up, this is just going to come down on me. And, I don't want to invite an argument about this. Or, we disagree, but it's not worth me voicing my opinion because we'll be here forever while we try to battle this out. All of those things work against the efforts of flow engineering. So it's very important for us to have that. And that's been my biggest learning as a facilitator, is how do we build that rapidly?
Right.
Because our whole thing in flow engineering is, we're saying we can do this quickly. We can do this quicker than you think.
Yeah.
And so, you've got to drop into that state of productive collaboration very quickly. Because it's, it's an absolute requirement.
Yeah. So you talk about value stream mapping, visualizing work, making the invisible visible. Like, this happens a lot in healthcare. It's not just a strictly observable physical process like you might see in manufacturing. People have to feel safe to be candid, to say things like, as you're mapping out the work and someone says, that's not how I do it. I do it differently. If they fear like they're going to get in trouble for admitting that, they're going to keep that to themselves and just let the mapping exercise march along. But then the organization doesn't have the opportunity to evaluate, maybe that person's way of doing the work is better.
Mm-hmm.
right? So we can not just visualize the work, but help improve the work. I mean, that's where it seems like psychological safety then is a foundation for doing what you're writing about and why you talk about it in the book. Yeah.
And that aspect that you highlighted, Andrew, about, it's very difficult to build trust, very easy to lose it. If you lose people along this process, we're really the early stages of flow engineering in any like continuous improvement effort is you're in the negative by stepping away from the work, right? You're just assessing, you're collecting information. This is not necessarily contributing to value until you get to the point where, okay, well, what do we do about all this stuff that we found? Where are the Kaizen improvement opportunities? Where are those? How do we redesign the flow to be better? And so if you lose people early, you're not going to benefit from their perspective and their contribution and their expertise when it comes time to actually produce why we're there in the first place, which is to re-engineer the system, to create a better flow and to actually get better outcomes.
Mm-hmm. There was, the point that Mark started off with about, there are no problems in reality, something like that. What we're doing, however we want to frame it, but what we're doing is we're dealing with a system that's continuously imperfect. It's continuously changing. We're continuously forgetting or making mistakes. The process is always unfolding. And so it's in a state of, perpetual imperfection. And so that means that we never quite know, are we doing things right or not? There's always this uncertainty, and that creates some pain. And normally when we have any kind of pain mentally, we freak out, right? It's like it. And so the sense of psychological safety extends to even feeling safe, even when there's pain arising in the mind, feeling safe, even when, I don't know what I'm doing, or I'm making a mistake, or I got criticized or something like that. And then that's a very deep level of psychological safety that you're like, the system's imperfect, but we're going to work one, I've seen the whole system. I've seen how it fits it all together, and it's a complete mess, and it's a disaster, and the performance is super low, and that's perfectly fine, right? And let's go forward. Let's work on it. That's a profound level of psychological safety.
Yeah. I mean, there's something to be said for accepting the current reality. I think of, Toyota people, former Toyota people that I've worked with, of just trying to accept, here's how it is. Let's avoid the game, the blame game. Let's just accept it for what it is, and now let's think forward about how are we going to improve the system. Like, there's a certain amount of emotional intelligence required for that, because it's easy to just react in a way of getting upset about, or people feeling a sense of shame. That's actually, I think, the more common dynamic. Even when there's no external fear, people in healthcare I've seen get very upset, and it's really, I think, more internally driven. The sense of shame of like, oh my gosh, our system is really screwed up, and we all care a lot. We've all been trying hard, but look how and people have to kind of work through those cycles in a way I don't feel qualified to help as an engineer. Like, you need more of a counselor mindset. And I think that's just, I got sidetracked there, but even when it's not externally driven fear, there's an interesting psychology of why people feel so bad about the current state and recent past that it becomes a barrier to moving forward.
It's one of the reasons we chose this term flow engineering, because it does have this sort of double meaning of team workflow, but as well as sense of psychological flow. It deals with the process, but as well it deals with the psychology of the individuals. And so, I feel like, that's somebody else's job to deal with the psychology of shame and so forth. But there's a sense in which if we really want to master flow in ourselves or in an organization, then we've got to start getting into these levels. That there's an engineering of sorts that we can do. Even, how do you undo? Like Steve said, how do you approach building a sense of psychological safety? How do you help people to deal with a sense of shame? Like, it is that very sense of shame that makes them such amazing healthcare workers, because they care about the patients. They want to do a good job. They absolutely never want to hurt anybody.
Mhm.
That is the most precious thing that's driving that organization, is that sense. I want to be a good person. I want to help. I never want to cause any harm. And then, so at some point, if you care enough, you pull the threads, you have to go beyond whatever it is, the code base or the patient's chart, and you have to get into these realms of psychology and sociology to try to figure out how you can engineer a better workplace for yourself and for everybody else around you.
Yeah. Well, so we've been talking today with Steve Pereira and Andrew Davis. Their book is Flow Engineering: From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. I wanted to ask one other question, whether or not you want to talk about some of the origin of how you met, how you started working together on the book. Maybe a better question is, did you have an opportunity to apply flow engineering concepts to the development and the writing of the book together? Imagine you're doing it remotely, collaboratively. I think of a book as being like software, kind of an iterative product development process. Do you treat it like a startup? I guess I'm asking, like, okay, how much did you get to eat your own dog food, as they say? Or what opportunities would there be writing another book?
I would say the first iteration of any flow is always going to be, you'll always think, oh, we could have gotten that done a lot faster. I joke, it took us 3.5 years to write a book about fast delivery, right? And
yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, and it gets manifested in many different ways along the road to the book. Like, we initially wrote a very different book. I think we've written the book 3 times. Our first stab at it was very much, let's divide and conquer, and we'll have 2 parts of the book. You write the first part, I'll write the second part. We'll work in parallel. This will be super efficient. We won't step on each other's toes. Delivered that book, and our publisher, of course, said, you wrote 2 books.
Yeah.
This is not 1 book.
Yeah.
And, that is a lesson in collaborative flow and thinking about, the entire end-to-end value stream of, these handoffs don't work. Delivering things in silos doesn't work. This trying to reconcile things late in the process doesn't work. We've learned all those things, and we continue to relearn all the time, because these are ideals. These are things that we strive for. These are things that don't necessarily come naturally to certainly to us, and which is maybe why we're really interested in this stuff. And I think that's really valuable, because trying to teach someone something that comes naturally to you, I think, is extremely challenging. But as someone who has learned this, right, and had to kind of learn this the hard way, that gives me the confidence to be able to say that we've got something that other people could learn from, that people can sort of adopt and pour it into their own experience, because this is not just us kind of surfing on our good fortunes.
Yeah. And there's no shame, or it's not that unusual what you described there of, again, the book being an iterative process. Sometimes the iterative cycle is, okay, whole book, and you're not the only ones who, kind of started over or made significant changes. I have a author friend of mine who's more of a journalist background, so he's really a writer's writer, and he says, if you publish the book you thought you were setting out to write, then something went wrong. Like, it's very natural and normal for things to evolve, but like you said, maybe there are lessons to be learned about how to iterate in smaller batches or smaller, quicker cycles, I guess.
There's definitely, a couple of key things that I thought were very helpful. Like, first of all, we very consciously started with beginning with the end in mind, thinking about what do we want to deliver to the reader? What do we want to kind of give them, and where do we want them to be by the time they finish the book? And then sort of think about laddering to that, or building a staircase to that. with the book, and that was very helpful. And then, of course, we had regular working sessions. I think, we really lost momentum when we lost a regular cadence of working in small batches. So yeah, I mean, I could go on. There's so much that really would be extremely helpful to this, because it is knowledge work, right? It's the same type of work that we're struggling with in all these different contexts.
Well, maybe we could do another episode someday diving into that topic, or as I get more into your book, will you write some sort of article or something, how to write a book using flow engineering concepts. I might have some ideas, or we can put our heads together and think, because different authors always or people who want to write a book ask for tips and thoughts and advice, and I have some experiences. That doesn't mean I have it all figured out. But yeah, I mean, how do we deliver, especially collaborative work? I did a book with a co-author, and it was a great experience. Joe Schwartz and I did our book Healthcare Kaizen. I don't think I ever had a hypothesis that having a co-author meant the book was going to be half the work, because it certainly was not half the work, or it would only be half the work if we did it the way you tried first. If you write that half, I'll write that half, and I mean, it was maybe almost the same amount of work, but the book was certainly better. It was much, much better than it would have been if I had tried writing it alone. I'm sure the same is true with your collaboration.
Undoubtedly, yeah.
I revisited recently, Steve and I mean, from the very beginning, even the cover of the book, we've got Post-it notes decorating the book, and it's Post-it notes throughout the whole book. And from the very beginning, he and I were doing it on a digital whiteboard. And I revisited that recently from November of 2020, right into the pandemic. We connected at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, now the Enterprise Technology Leadership Summit, the digital version. And the original ideas that we set forth on what we wanted to accomplish in the book are basically what we ended up with. Now, we took a very long, circuitous route in there, but I would say, I know my thinking has evolved dramatically. Like in that very long, circuitous path, I have come to understand the world in a dramatically different way. I feel like that was kind of I did a tremendous amount of thinking about how all this stuff fits together. And the vast majority of my thinking and my writing was not published in the book. But it's like, so I've changed, my understanding's evolved, and I'm, looking forward to other opportunities to share.
Yeah. I forget who this would be attributed to, but the idea of, a great way to deepen your knowledge of a subject is to start writing a book about something you feel like you know a little bit about. And in that process, you end up understanding it even better. To your point, Steve, how do you articulate it to others? That's knowing how to do something and knowing how to teach it or communicate it are, related but different.
I think that, that the level of understanding that you gain from trying to teach something is unparalleled. And one of the hacks that I fortunately stumbled into early in my career was signing up to speak at events about topics that I felt interested in and I felt passionate about, but I didn't feel like an expert in any sense. And I would, if I could pitch this and it gets accepted, that's enough motivation for me to get it into shape and deliver it such that I do not embarrass myself and make everyone's experience at this event horrible. And that I felt was a super hack, something that obligation, the deadline, all those things really worked to help me, get my thinking straight, get the ideas in a state that I could present them effectively. And that's really effective.
Yeah.
Then you really start working backwards. You're like, okay.
Exactly.
And if you combine that with procrastination, you're golden, right? It's like, okay, presentation's tomorrow. I need to be on
Right.
All right, how do we do this?
Yeah. That's why conferences always want you to send the slides 2 months in advance.
Exactly.
They're guarding against the procrastination.
Yeah.
Here's some slides. This is absolutely not what I'll be presenting, but here's some slides. Because look, I mean, if I haven't learned anything in the last 2 months, that would make my presentation better, I'm doing a terrible job.
Mm-hmm.
But well, this has been fun. I've enjoyed talking with our guests again, Steve Pereira, Andrew Davis. The book is Flow Engineering: From Value Stream Mapping to Effective Action. The show notes, I'll have links to websites and the book and more. Anything else that either of you would like to say to give kind of a wrap up final word? That's like the worst, most open-ended question, but anything else you'd like to say here as we close?
Well, luckily, we don't like to talk too much, so it'll be quick. But no, this has been a wonderful privilege. We, as aspiring podcasters and content creators, we really admire what you've done with this series and your other series. Your other series alone is reached a level of consistency that truly establishes trust, and I admire that a lot. So thank you personally for me.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I wasn't trying to. I'm going to start asking that question in a way that doesn't make it sound like I'm fishing for a compliment.
Oh, I didn't take it that way at all.
Okay. No. I should have been more gracious about that instead of self-effacing. Thank you. Thank you for saying that, Steve. Andrew, I'll give you the last word.
Well, anyway, also delighted to be here, and really happy to have a chance to share these ideas. And hopefully, this gives technologists who are listening, a much broader sense of the world, and the lean people who are listening, a sense that their message is resonating into the tech community. And even though the tech community is operating, orders of magnitude faster than some of these other in real life processes, the same principles apply.
Yeah.
Well,
the book makes that very clear. So thank you for that work there. But Steve, sorry.
I forgot about this, but I would love to hear from, folks in, your neck of the woods in healthcare. If anybody is putting these practices to work and learning and finding gaps or things that, we haven't spoken about, or things that, are unclear in their context, I'd love to hear from them, on LinkedIn or through email in any way possible. Because, we really see this type of work applying in any kind of collaborative environment. So I'd love to see it tested in contexts like healthcare. That's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, good. I hope some people will reach out. So Steve, Andrew, thanks again. Really appreciate you being here.
Great pleasure.
Thank you. Lots of fun.